Here's a thesis for you. Zora Neale Hurston, the great American novelist and wildly underrated essayist. I guess a volume of her essays has appeared fairly recently, but I might have some misgivings. Is a transcendentalist, an American transcendentalist. There are lots of transcendentalists and lots of sort of transcendentalist connected literary figures such as Melville or Whitman, who I'm happy to count as transcendentalists really, and Emerson and Thoreau, of course, Margaret Fuller. You know, there are many others that are rarely studied, I guess, these days, like Theodore Parker, really fascinating. Probably wrote Civil Disobedience before Thoreau did, or around the same time, the same point. Or Orestes Brownson, fascinating, complex figure. All right. But Emerson, Thoreau, and Hurston, those are the great transcendentalists, essayists, and philosophers. That's right. That's my view, okay? I've loved Zora Neale Hurston very much for a very long time. A chapter in my book, Act Like You Know, African American Autobiography and White Identity, devoted to Hurston. And I guess I've just been loving on Hurston ever since someone made me read Their Eyes Were Watching God. I was hooked, and when I started reading the essays, I really fell in love. And I really think that the philosophy is quite the same as Emerson and Thoreau, which is the characteristically American philosophy. Now, those Emerson and Thoreau people are Massachusetts transcendentalists, and Zora Neale Hurston is a Florida transcendentalist. They are male transcendentalists, and she's a female transcendentalist. They are white transcendentalists, and she's a black transcendentalist. But Lord knows they've got a lot in common, and I intend to prove it. All right, so I'm going to read this paper, also from, I gave this at the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy 2 years ago in Winter Park, Florida, right next to Eatonville, the black town that Zora Neale Hurston grew up in and often returned to and portrayed in her novels and in her nonfiction. These are both more or less neighborhoods of Orlando now. At any rate, so I'm going to try to prove that Zora Neale Hurston is an American transcendentalist. Do you find that disturbing? Across the race line? Or across the temporal? Or across the gender? Because do you associate American transcendentalism with what? Something bad that Hurston wouldn't be? She might be those bad things too, though, whatever you're thinking. But all the good stuff too. All right. One title I've given this, Zora Neale Hurston and Henry David Thoreau had the same philosophy. Zora Neale Hurston ought to be considered a late blooming, but a very blooming American transcendentalist, despite the distance between them, Massachusetts to Florida, 1850 to 1925, male to female, white to black. She and Thoreau have fundamentally similar or identical underlying philosophies. It's a good philosophy. True, I want to say. And it has one other big advantage. Several of the best writers America has produced. Here, I'll try to show that Zora takes up the transcendentalist. For example, that has an advantage over pragmatism, which only has one of the best writers America has produced, William James. But then you have to struggle through Peirce and Dewey. A bunch of others. Here, I'll try to show that Zora takes up the transcendentalist mantle in a number of respects, and also that she makes many contributions to a tradition of thought and writing that was thoroughly out of fashion by the time she worked. That's one difference between 1850 and 1925. Now, frankly, enlisting Zora is a way to defend transcendentalism against charges of sexism and reaction. That both Emerson and Thoreau frequently praised positions they admired as virile, for example, or even the manliness of some attitude or whatever. Or that Thoreau's aunt did his laundry. I think we need more research on that. But do we really? When he was living at Walden Pond. Are, Hurston might help me suggest, adventitious rather than intrinsic drawbacks. Sometimes you get the feeling that the laundry situation is enough to refute Thoreau's convictions. Pond scum approach. The laundry situation is enough to refute Thoreau's convictions, concluding straight away, one supposes, that we are obliged to obey unjust laws for the good of the collective. Premise, Thoreau's aunt did his laundry. Conclusion, we're obliged to obey unjust laws for the good of the collective. That's the quality of a lot of the discourse about Henry David Thoreau in recent years. Or else someone else should have done, on the other hand, maybe someone else should have done Zora's laundry for her. Her uncle, maybe. So she could write instead. At any rate, to determine whether figure Z is a transcendentalist, we'd have to figure out what transcendentalism is. To begin with, I urge that the name is really very unfortunate. For example, in his book, The Metaphysical Club, Louis Menand, lured partly by the word itself, transcendentalism, which derives its use from Kant, makes Kant, Hegel, and Coleridge fundamental influences on Emerson and Thoreau. My own view is that their philosophy, despite moments of flirtation or interest, is quite the opposite of German idealism, or any sort of idealism. I just don't think there's any doubt about that, if you can read these texts at all. Menand. I'd rename it immanentalism, as opposed to transcendentalism, if I could, but that's not the one sort of thing one can do unilaterally. I characterize American transcendentalism of the Massachusetts or the Florida variety in terms of two basic dimensions or doctrines: pantheism and individualism. These are interconnected, in tension, and in complement. They are relatively straightforward positions, or at least easy to state in a sentence. The world is sacred, and the human individual is the fundamental moral agent, let's say. But as actually developed in Emerson or Hurston's writings, they are complex positions, elaborately refined. Also, as each would be quite happy to tell you, developing a completely coherent philosophy at the most abstract general level, working like Immanuel Kant, or for that matter John Dewey, was not their goal. Their goal was to write the truth of their experience, even in its internal conflicts and ambiguities. And their writing is as much poetry, of course, as exposition, more like drawing a beautiful or revelatory picture than like knocking down opponents with arguments. They're important philosophers nevertheless, I feel. Now, I am a pantheist is not much in the Thoreau-Emerson vein. They like to keep such things ambiguous. Nevertheless, let me sketch their pantheist-ish picture. Everything in the universe is connected on a single ontological plane. This includes ourselves and God, if any. God, if we want to use the term, and they do, is immanent in the universe and present to us in it. And we are ourselves, without remainder, of the natural order, which is the divine order. Ontologically, we're the same sort of thing as rocks or trees or fishes, exhaustively individuated by our real-world relations. That is, there is nothing of us that is not part of the material world, let's call it nature, and the material world is also God or an aspect of God. Spinoza, beloved of all these figures, makes the fundamental turn that is so beautifully expressed in Thoreau and Hurston. This is Ethics Proposition 15. I do not know why matter should be unworthy of the divine nature. That's what, for example, Nietzsche admired about Emerson and about Spinoza. The world affirmation, which begins by saying, there is nothing higher than this reality, nothing more real than the world we experience, not the forms, not things in themselves, and not a transcendent God. We're here, we might say, to learn to love the world, starting with the very place we are. When I get old, writes Hurston, and my joints and bones tell me about it, I can sit around and write for myself, if nobody else, and read slowly and carefully the mysticism of the East, and reread Spinoza with love and care. I expect she did. And in her own way, Hurston is very much as much a nature writer as Thoreau. Zora was the tree-lovingest thing since Henry, a real cultist. They are her central symbol almost every time out, but in Hurston, trees are never mere symbols. She attends to their specific materiality as closely as does Thoreau, but in another register. The tree is a fundamental symbol and a fundamental reality connecting Hurston's people and Hurston herself to the world, appears in dust tracks on a road, Seraph of the Suwannee, and famously, in their eyes were watching God. Here's a passage from Their Eyes Were Watching God. It was a spring afternoon in West Florida. You may recall this from early on. Janie had spent most of the day under a blossoming pear tree in the backyard. She had been spending every minute that she could steal from her chores under that tree for the last 3 days. That was to say, ever since the first tiny bloom had opened, it had called her to come and gaze on a mystery. From barren brown stems to glistening leaf buds, from the leaf buds to snowy virginity of bloom. It stirred her tremendously. How? Why? It was like a flute song, forgotten in another existence and remembered again. What? How? Why? This singing, she heard, had nothing to do with her ears. The rose of the world was breathing out smell. Oh, to be a pear tree, any tree, in bloom. Now, no doubt this is pretty straightforwardly a sexual awakening. It's also an awakening to the world, in the body, in its and our sensuous connections. I believe in the forest and in the meadow and in the night in which the corn grows, writes Thoreau. Methinks we might elevate ourselves a little more. This is from Walking, the essay. We might climb a tree. I found my account in climbing a tree once. It was a tall white pine on top of a hill. Above all, I discovered around me, it was near the end of June, on the ends of the topmost branches only, a few minute and delicate red cone-like blossoms, the fertile flower of white pine looking heavenward. I carried straight away to the village the topmost spire, and showed it to a stranger juryman who walked the streets, for it was court week in Concord, and to the farmers and lumber dealers and wood choppers and hunters, and not one had seen the like before, but they wondered at a star dropped down. I was only happy in the woods, and when the ecstatic Florida springtime came strolling from the sea, trance glorifying the world with its aura, writes Hurston, dust tracks on road. The water life, the smothering foliage that draped the riverbanks, the miles of purple hyacinths, all thrilled me anew. The wild thing was back in the jungle. In wildness, Zora's wildness in particular, is the preservation of the world. I wish that wasn't a coffee cup. Here's a quote from Zora. This is a letter to Lawrence Jordan from Palatka, Florida, in 1927. Florida, gorgeous sunlight, fleas, flowers, frogs, ferns, alligators, poincianas, flies, cypress, roses, magnolias, roaches, hyacinths by the mile, fleas, fruit, flies, cool nights, fleas, roaches, bougainvillea, gnats, pines, roaches, chinaberry trees, fleas, bedbugs, and magnolias amid dazzling palms and stretches of water. Ecstatic nature poem, man. In a letter, Florida isn't New England. Maybe they're opposites in some ways, in the east coast of the of North America kind of way. And a person in non-distinctness from one isn't the same as a person in non-distinctness from the other. One person is temperate and relatively dry, the other lush, humid, and tropical. But in the condition of identifying ecstatically with one's world, and loving flowers too, they are the same. Now, I don't think Hurston ever quite says, I am a pantheist. None of them do. But she does say, I'm an individualist. And she says it over and over again. Sorry. She does. So here's a quote from Hurston. Many people have pointed out to me that I am a Negro and that I am poor. Why then have I not joined the party of protest? I will tell you why. I see many good points in, let's say, the Communist Party. Anyone would be a liar and a fool to claim that there was no good in it. But I am so put together that I do not have much of a herd instinct. Or if I must, Or if I must be connected with a flock, let me be the shepherd my own self. That is just the way I'm made. Compare Thoreau. Know all men by these presents that I, Henry Thoreau, do not wish to be regarded as a member of any incorporated society which I have not joined. Or Emerson on Fourierism. Fourierism? Marxism's more fantastical predecessor. Quote, it contains so much truth. Remember, like, you'd be a fool to deny there was some truth in communism. It contains so much truth, says Emerson of Fourierism, and promised in the attempts that shall be made to realize it so much valuable instruction, that we are engaged to observe its progress. Yet, in spite of the assurances of its friends that it was new and widely discriminated from all other plans for reform with which the brain of the age teems, our feeling was that Fourier had skipped no fact but one, namely life. That's from an essay called Fourierism and the Socialists. In one of the essays appended to the end of Dust Tracks on a Road, her autobiography, odd autobiography, as many have pointed out, Hurston formulates the position as explicitly as possible. I found that I had no need of either class or race prejudice, those scourges of humanity. The solace of easy generalization was taken from me, but I received the richer gift of individualism. When I have been made to suffer, or when I've been made happy by others, I've known that individuals were responsible for that, and not races. All clumps of people turn out to be individuals on close inspection. All clumps of people turn out to be individuals on close inspection. As in Emerson and Thoreau, the individualism emerges from and feeds back into the metaphysics or the fundamental ontology. Each thing and each event and each person is incomparable. No two moments, Hurston writes, are any more alike than two snowflakes. Like snowflakes, they get the same look from being so plentiful and falling so close together. But examine them closely and see the multiple differences between them. Each moment has its own task and capacity and doesn't melt down like snow and form again. It keeps its character forever. Individualism of any variety perhaps requires some explanation and defense these days. It rang through the 20th century and it rings still as reactionary, capitalist, even as racist and sexist. To many people, it seems, individualism connotes little but self-seeking. And that is definitely not what it meant to Emerson or Hurston. People seem to think it's self-evidently ridiculous that it pictures each of us as a big male ego who needs no other person, maybe taking self-reliance as the only mood or note Emerson ever hit, and then reading even that through a modified Marxist lens that has the whole world squared off between progressive collectivism and retrograde individualism. One refutes individualism thus. Emerson had a social support system partly consisting of women. Then you get HDT, pond scum. Now, to begin with, for Emerson, Thoreau, and Hurston, human individuals are real, though also defined by their relations to other things and other people. The human individual, on this accounting, is not a fundamental substance in the old-time metaphysical vein, an independently existing thing to be characterized by its intrinsic properties. A man is a bundle of relations, a knot of roots, whose flower and fruitage is the world, writes Emerson. A man is a bundle of relations, a knot of roots. That includes social relations, of course, and neither Thoreau nor Hurston denies that social relations are partly constitutive of the self, that we emerge from other people, need them to live, and begin to learn something from them about who we are. But one thing that's very distinctive about the Transcendentalist approach, the human relations are not regarded as exclusively constitutive, as they seem to be in Dewey or Marx, for example. Non-human things make us too. We eat and breathe them after all. If our identities are partly collective, the collectives include non-human things, which at the fundamental level are the same sort of things we are, material things. In the political realm, what transcendentalist individualism means, above all, is the right and the obligation to dissent from consensus, as expressed canonically in civil disobedience. There might be John Stuart Mill style or classical liberal arguments underlying this attitude, but the appeal is a lot more visceral than that, and a lot more intrinsic to the personalities putting it forward. Rebellious and skeptical personalities of the sort that both Hurston and Thoreau were. Each of us is the universe in microcosm, sacred in some sense. Each is to be presumed of equal value. Each expresses a unique point of view, a potential for enlightenment, innovation, new understanding. No one's identity can be fully specified as an intersection of social groups, for example. Also, when people appear unanimous, as when, on a couple of occasions, Hurston's friend Langston Hughes dragged her to a Communist Party meeting, Thoreau and Hurston suspect that they are not sincere and have a strong impulse to disagree. A better future involves exploring and enhancing and loving human difference, not processing us all into a smooth human gazpacho. It's not that Zora didn't centralize human relationships. She was empirical about them more or less as Thoreau was with his seeds. She had many intense relationships with people of all sorts, observed them carefully and with delight. She vividly, in detail, felt connected to black diaspora culture in Haiti, in Jamaica, in New Orleans, in Harlem, and in Central America. She delighted in songs and stories, especially those emerging in some sense from traditions of resistance. But she also kept finding and cherishing individuals wherever she went. She accused W.B. Du Bois, Alain Locke, and Richard Wright of portraying black folks as types, of omitting nothing but life. Yes, those are messages coming through my computer. Somehow I got to turn off notifications. Now, being an anti-collectivist had quite a different ring in 1840 than in 1940. Thoreau could have read Marx. I don't know that he did, however. He kind of read German, maybe. High industrialism and robber baron capitalism, world and coal wars, fascism and communism as world-conquering ideologies and accounts of history. Emerson and Thoreau probably didn't see that coming. Hurston is operating in a completely different context, even if we try to leave aside, which we most assuredly should not, the racial and gender differences. Emerson and Transcendentalist preacher Theodore Parker, let's say, were quite privileged people, even if they lived relatively modestly, while Hurston struggled in ways they did not. She fought her whole life to be a writer, not a maid. She, quote, never owned a reliable typewriter, unquote. She died penniless, literally penniless, she says in a late letter. But across these profound differences, their basic philosophy is the same, which, loving both of them, Thoreau and Hurston, very much, I find compelling. I take it to suggest that any sort of person could feel the power of these ideas, though they will also produce and believe them somewhat differently. Or not any sort of person, but a particular sort, who could be white, black, male, female, or none or all of these, but in very different contexts. If you were a transcendentalist in 1840, You were a member of a movement that was sweeping American letters and lyceums. Your individualism and post-religious spirituality were fashionable and progressive. If you were a Transcendentalist in 1930, you were almost incomprehensible. And if you were a black Transcendentalist, you were, not inappropriately given some of these positions, basically alone. You had a tendency to cock an eyebrow skeptically at every slogan that those around you accepted. You were an anti-fascist for sure, but also an anti-communist, which made you more or less incomprehensible to all those concerned. Thoreau and Hurston both thought of themselves as rebels, I dare say. She had quite a bit more to directly rebel against. Permit me to lurch toward a conclusion. As well as trees, Thoreau and Hurston both took a worshipful stance toward mountains. Here is Hurston's very Hurstonian Moses in Moses, Man of the Mountain. Early afternoon, he saw his first mountain. It made him feel as if he had been lacking something vital to life all along. He saw the great mountain at a distance lifting its rocky crown above the world, and he was dumbstruck with awe. To him, it had its being in grandeur, so it was right and proper to draw apart from the surrounding country and hide its mysteries in its heart. It was near, it was far. It called, it forbade. It was all things to his inner consciousness. He must believe in gods again, for here was the tomb of a god 1,000 times as great as the pyramids. No, it was not a negative and vain thing like a pyramid, whose builders were puny pygmies about the toes of this mountain. This was not a mere pile of stone. It had an aura of clouds upon its brow. This sublime earth form was the living place of a god, certainly. It had peace and fury upon its face. And now here's Thoreau, ascending Katahdin. It was in fact a cloud factory. These were cloud works. Some part of the beholder, even some vital part, seems to escape the loose gratings of his ribs as he ascends. Nature was here something savage and awful, though beautiful. It was fresh. It was the fresh and natural surface of planet Earth. What is it to be admitted to a museum, to see a myriad of particular things, compared with being shown some star's surface, some hard matter in its home? I stand in awe of my body. This matter to which I am bound has become so strange to me. Talk of mysteries. Think of our life in nature. Daily to be shown some matter, to come into contact with it. Rocks, trees, wind in our cheeks, the solid earth, the actual world, the common sense, contact. Who are we? Where are we? That's from the Maine Woods. That's one of my favorite passages. In literature, I've quoted so many times. Several of these I have, really. I don't know whether, Hurston read that, who are we? Where are we? But recall her how, why. It was like a flute song forgotten in another existence and remembered again. What? How? Why? Either way, hers is, they have the same spirit. I mean, very, very vividly. As writers and as thinkers, as experiencers. Here's Hurston, one of my favorite passages. Life as it is, this is so transcendentalist, man. Life as it is does not frighten me. This is why transcendentalism is a bad name for all this. Life as it is does not frighten me, since I have made peace with the universe as I find it and bow to its laws. The ever sleepless sea in its bed, crying out how long to time, million-formed and never motionless flame. The contemplation of these two aspects alone affords me sufficient food for 10 spans of my expected lifetime. It seems to me that organized creeds are collections of words around a wish. I feel no need for such. Somebody else may have my rapturous glance at the archangels. The springing of the yellow line of morning out of the misty deep of dawn is glory enough for me. I know that nothing is destructible. Things merely change forms. When the consciousness we know as life ceases, I know that I shall still be part and parcel of the world. I was a part before the sun rolled into shape and burst forth in the glory of change. I was when the earth was hurled out from its fiery rim. I shall return with the earth to Father Sun and still exist in substance when the sun has lost its fire and disintegrated in infinity, to perhaps become part of the whirling rubble of space. Why fear? The stuff of my being is matter, ever changing, ever moving, but never lost. So what need of denominations and creeds to deny myself the comfort of all my fellow men? The wide belt of the universe has no need for finger rings. I am one with the infinite and need no other assurance. Kick-ass Zora, Neale, Hurston. That's as canonical a statement of American Transcendentalism as you can find, as any passage in Thoreau, or Emerson, or Theodore Parker, or Rusty Brownson, or Margaret Fuller, or whomever you count. So now we need to re-anthologize the Transcendentalists to include Zora. Raise problems if you like, though. I know there are some. PCO on this rainy day. April 3rd, 2024, in Rappahannock County, Virginia.